the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Florence, where marble statues cast long shadows and whispered conspiracies echoed through vaulted chambers, a man sat hunched over parchment, his quills scratching against the silence of exile. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, once secretary to the Florentine Republic, now found himself stripped of power, suspected of conspiracy, and banished to his modest estate in Sant'Andrea. Yet in this forced solitude, surrounded by olive groves and the distant memory of political glory, he would craft the most ruthless manual for power ever conceived. The candle flickered as he wrote, casting dancing shadows across pages that would one day be whispered about in royal courts and condemned from church pulpits. This was not merely a treatise on governance. It was a surgical dissection of human nature itself, a blueprint for those who dared to reach beyond the constraints of conventional morality to seize what others could only dream of possessing. As autumn rain drummed against the shutters of his villa, Machiavelli reflected on the rise and fall of princes he had witnessed, the crushing weight of their emotional attachments, and the devastating consequences of their human weaknesses. He had seen good men destroyed by their very goodness, watched as noble intentions paved roads to political ruin, and observed how those who felt too deeply inevitably fell to those who felt nothing at all. The principle crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. Emotion was the enemy of achievement, sentiment the assassin of success. Those who would rule must first learn to kill the weak self that dwelt within, that trembling creature of feelings, fears, and false hopes that made men predictable, manipulable, and ultimately conquerable. The architecture of emotional detachment, the transformation began not with grand gestures but with small deaths, the systematic elimination of every soft emotion that had once made the individual human. Like a sculptor chiseling away marble to reveal the statue within, the aspiring prince must carve away compassion, chisel off guilt, and polish away the last vestiges of what others called conscience. In the merchant republics of northern Italy, Machiavelli had observed this transformation in real time. Lorenzo de' Medici had not been born cold. He had made himself so through calculated practice. Each day he would force himself to make one decision based purely on advantage rather than feeling. When his childhood friend requested a loan that would never be repaid, Lorenzo calculated the cost of friendship against the value of discipline. The friend was refused, and with that refusal, another fragment of the old Lorenzo died. The process required what Machiavelli termed the daily murder of sentiment. Every morning, the aspiring ruler must identify one emotion that had influenced their previous day's decisions and systematically eliminate its influence. Fear of confrontation must be strangled. The desire to be liked must be suffocated. The need for approval must be starved until it withered away entirely. This was not mere callousness. It was strategic optimization. Emotions were inefficiencies in the human machine, glitches in the software of ambition. They caused miscalculations, poor timing, and worst of all, predictability. An enemy who could predict your emotional responses could manipulate them, turning your very humanity into a weapon against you. The merchant princes who survived the brutal politics of Renaissance Italy learned to view emotions as luxury items they could no longer afford. Cosimo the Elder had once wept at his father's funeral. His son Piero learned to calculate the political value of public grief. By the time Lorenzo the Magnificent inherited power, tears had become theatrical props, deployed only when they served strategic purposes. Machiavelli documented the methodical process by which successful rulers learned to feel nothing while appearing to feel everything. They studied their own emotional responses like scientists examining specimens, noting which feelings made them weak and which could be weaponized. They practiced emotional responses in mirrors, perfecting the performance of humanity while systematically destroying its substance within themselves. The Duke of Valentino, Cesare Borgia, became Machiavelli's ultimate case study in emotional engineering. Borgia had not been born a monster. Contemporary accounts describe him as a charming young man, beloved by his tutors and genuinely fond of his siblings. Yet by the time Machiavelli encountered him, Borgia had become something else entirely, a perfectly calibrated instrument of will, unmarred by the hesitation that destroyed lesser men. Borgia's transformation had been deliberate and systematic. He began by observing his own reactions during moments of stress, cataloging which emotions arose and how they influenced his decisions. Fear made him hesitate, so he trained himself to feel excitement where others felt terror. Guilt made him second-guess, so he rewired his internal reward system to find satisfaction in actions others would find reprehensible. The process was neither quick nor easy. Borgia described it to Machiavelli as learning to live in winter, a gradual numbing that eventually became comfortable, then preferable to the chaos of feeling. He practiced on small matters first, ordering the execution of a disloyal servant without flinching, breaking a promise to a minor ally without guilt, lying to his own family without shame. Each successful suppression of natural human response strengthened his capacity for the greater emotional violence that true power required. Yet this emotional detachment was not an end in itself, but a foundation for something far more sophisticated: the ability to manipulate others through the very emotions one had learned to suppress in oneself. A man who no longer felt fear could manufacture it in others with surgical precision. Someone who had killed their own capacity for love could weaponize the love others felt for them. The most successful practitioners learned to maintain detailed mental maps of others' emotional landscapes while keeping their own internal territory barren and controlled. They became emotional vampires, feeding on the feelings of others while giving nothing genuine in return. Every interaction became a calculation, every relationship a resource to be optimized. This required developing what Machiavelli called the split consciousness, the ability to observe one's own performance from outside while executing it from within. The ruler learned to watch themselves deploy charm, express concern, or display anger while simultaneously calculating the optimal duration, intensity, and target of each emotional display. They became actors so skilled that they could convince themselves of their own performances while never forgetting that they were performances. The training extended to physical discipline as well. Emotional detachment required control over every involuntary response that might betray weakness or genuine feeling. Successful rulers practiced controlling their breathing during stressful negotiations, learned to maintain steady eye contact while delivering devastating news, and trained their voices to remain level while pronouncing sentences of death. They studied their own faces in mirrors during moments of rage, learning to smooth away the micro-expressions that might reveal their true state. They practiced receiving terrible news with equanimity, good news with measured satisfaction, and betrayal with calculating interest rather than hurt. Every natural human response was identified, analyzed, and either eliminated or transformed into a tool of manipulation. The psychological architecture that emerged from this systematic self-destruction was both magnificent and monstrous. Where ordinary humans experienced the chaos of conflicting emotions, the perfected ruler enjoyed crystalline clarity of purpose. Where others wrestled with conscience and doubt, they moved through the world with the fluid certainty of a blade cutting through silk. Yet perhaps the most crucial insight was that this emotional death was not truly death at all. It was metamorphosis. The feelings had not vanished but had been transmuted into something far more potent. Pure will, undiluted by sentiment and uncompromised by the weakness that made other men human. Like a snake shedding its skin, the successful ruler emerged from the process fundamentally transformed, no longer bound by the limitations that constrained those who still believed in the luxury of feeling. The science of strategic cruelty in the marble halls, where power was won and lost. Machiavelli discovered that cruelty was not an aberration but an art form, one that required the same studied precision as painting or poetry. The weak scattered their violence randomly, letting emotion guide their hand, making their cruelty personal and therefore ultimately self-defeating. The strong learned to apply force with the calculated precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting only what was necessary and only when the timing would maximize the healing that followed. Cesare Borgia's conquest of the Romagna provided the perfect laboratory for studying strategic brutality. When Borgia appointed Ramiro de Orco as his lieutenant, he knew the man's reputation for excessive cruelty. This was not an oversight, but a calculated decision. De Orco would serve as the instrument of necessary violence, imposing order through fear, while Borgia remained at a distance, his hands apparently clean. The genius of the strategy became clear in its conclusion. After de Orco had served his purpose, breaking the resistance of local strongmen and establishing the fear that makes governance possible, Borgia had him executed and his body displayed in the public square. With this single act, he accomplished multiple objectives. He demonstrated that he would not tolerate excessive cruelty. He showed that even his closest allies were subject to justice, and he transferred all the hatred generated by the previous violence onto a man who was now dead. The crowd that had cursed Borgia's name the night before now praised his justice. The very people who had suffered under de Orco's brutality now saw Borgia as their deliverer. This was cruelty transformed into statecraft, violence alchemically transmuted into legitimacy. Machiavelli recognized that such strategic cruelty required a fundamental reconceptualization of human suffering. The ruler who flinched at causing pain would inevitably cause more pain through their hesitation and half measures. Like a physician who must cut deeply to remove a tumor, the effective prince learned to inflict sharp, decisive harm that prevented the greatest suffering that would result from weakness or delay. The key was understanding the temporal dynamics of cruelty. Violence applied gradually created prolonged suffering and sustained resentment. The victim had time to adapt, to build resistance, to gather allies and plan revenge. But cruelty applied swiftly and completely shocked the system into acceptance. The sharp pain of decisive action quickly faded, replaced by the relief of certainty and the gratitude that comes when people realize the alternative could have been far worse. This principle extended beyond physical violence to every form of coercion and control. When dismissing allies who had become liabilities, the skilled ruler learned to do so completely and immediately, cutting off all contact and support rather than allowing the relationship to die slowly. When breaking promises that had become inconvenient, they did so openly and entirely, providing clear reasons and immediate compensation rather than hoping the other party wouldn't notice gradual erosion of commitment. The psychological preparation required for strategic cruelty was perhaps even more important than its tactical deployment. Rulers had to learn to view human suffering as data rather than tragedy, to see the tears of their victims as information about the effectiveness of their methods rather than cause for regret or hesitation. This required developing what Machiavelli termed the surgeon's eye, the ability to see through the surface of human drama to the underlying structural necessities. Just as a surgeon learned to ignore a patient's screams and focus on the precision required to save their life, the strategic ruler learned to look past immediate human suffering to the long-term stability and prosperity that decisive action would create. The most sophisticated practitioners learned to use others' emotional responses to cruelty as diagnostic tools. If a punishment created the desired behavioral change with minimal resentment, it had been properly calibrated. If it generated ongoing resistance or excessive hatred, it had been either too severe or too mild, both errors to be avoided in future applications. They studied the after-effects of their harsh decisions with scientific rigor, noting which forms of punishment created lasting deterrence and which merely bred hidden rebellion. They learned to distinguish between fear that paralyzed and fear that motivated, between respect born of strength and hatred disguised as submission. The timing of cruelty became an art in itself. Applied too early, it was wasteful and potentially counterproductive. People were not yet ready to accept its necessity. Applied too late, it appeared desperate rather than decisive, weakness masquerading as strength. The master politician learned to read the precise moment when harsh action would be welcomed rather than resented, when people would be grateful for the strong hand that ended uncertainty and chaos. Environmental factors played crucial roles in the effective deployment of strategic cruelty. Public punishments during times of general fear and instability were received differently than the same actions during periods of peace and prosperity. The ruler learned to synchronize their harsh measures with external pressures that made their subjects more receptive to decisive leadership. Weather, economic conditions, external threats, and even seasonal cycles all influenced how cruelty would be perceived and remembered. A harsh winter that made people desperate for strong leadership created opportunities for actions that would be unthinkable during a prosperous spring. The skilled prince learned to read these environmental conditions like a farmer reading the seasons, knowing when the soil of public opinion was ready for the harsh seeds of necessary violence. Perhaps most importantly, strategic cruelty required perfect emotional control from its practitioner. Any hint of sadistic pleasure would undermine its effectiveness, marking the ruler as a tyrant rather than a stern but just leader. Conversely, any visible reluctance or guilt would signal weakness, inviting future challenges and reducing the deterrent effect of the harsh action. The most effective rulers learned to display what appeared to be genuine regret while taking decisive action, not regret for the action itself, but regret that circumstances had made such action necessary. They perfected the art of seeming to be reluctant instruments of necessity rather than eager agents of violence. This performance required extraordinary psychological sophistication. The ruler had to genuinely believe in the necessity of their harsh actions while simultaneously maintaining enough emotional distance to calibrate their severity precisely. They became method actors of power, convincing themselves of their own reluctance while never allowing that reluctance to actually influence their decisions. The long-term psychological effects on the practitioner of strategic cruelty were profound and irreversible. Each successful application of calculated violence made the next application easier, not because they became sadistic, but because they became more convinced of the method's effectiveness. They developed an addiction not to causing pain, but to the clarity and efficiency that came from being willing to cause whatever pain was strategically optimal. Over time, they found it increasingly difficult to understand why others found their methods shocking or immoral. The results spoke for themselves. Territories pacified, enemies neutralized, order established where chaos had reigned. The tears and screams that had once troubled them became as meaningless as the noise of construction. Temporary unpleasantness that preceded lasting improvement. This transformation was irreversible because it was fundamentally logical. Once someone had experienced the effectiveness of strategic cruelty, returning to the half-measures and hesitations of conventional morality felt not just impractical, but actively harmful. They had seen behind the curtain of civilized society and discovered that its peace and prosperity rested on a foundation of carefully calibrated violence, mostly hidden but always present. The final stage of mastery came when the ruler no longer needed to consciously calculate the optimal level of cruelty. It became instinctive, as natural as breathing. They could sense, almost intuitively, exactly how much force was required in any given situation, neither more nor less than what would achieve their objectives with maximum efficiency and minimum long-term cost. At this level, cruelty transcended mere tactics and became a form of artistry. The master practitioner could inflict precisely the right amount of suffering to achieve any desired outcome, could time their harsh actions to maximize both immediate effectiveness and long-term acceptance, and could deploy violence with such precision that their victims often ended up grateful for the experience. This was not sadism, but something far more refined and dangerous. Cruelty as a perfected tool of statecraft, violence as a medium of artistic expression, suffering as raw material to be shaped into stability and order. It represented the complete triumph of strategic thinking over human sentiment, the ultimate victory of the calculating mind over the feeling heart, the alchemy of absolute will. In the deepest chambers of his exile, where even the servants rarely ventured, Machiavelli contemplated the final transformation that separated the merely successful from the truly transcendent. Here, in this realm beyond ordinary cruelty and calculated emotion, lay the secret that had elevated certain individuals from clever manipulators to forces of historical inevitability. They had discovered how to transmute the base metal of human desire into the gold of absolute will. This was not merely the absence of feeling or the strategic application of force. It was something far more radical and complete. It was the systematic replacement of every human impulse with pure intention, every natural response with calculated purpose. Where ordinary people experienced want, the perfected ruler experienced only will. Where others felt need, they felt only direction. Where the masses were driven by the chaos of competing desires, the master had achieved the terrifying simplicity of singular purpose. The process began with what Machiavelli observed in the later years of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. The man who had once been motivated by lust, greed, and familial ambition had undergone a transformation so complete that these drives had become merely tools in service of something larger and more abstract. His desires had not disappeared. They had been reorganized under the absolute authority of his will. Alexander had learned to want only what served his purposes, to desire only what advanced his plans, to love only what strengthened his position. His famous appetites had not been suppressed but had been conscripted into the service of his greater design. Lust became a means of creating useful alliances and dangerous dependencies. Greed became a method of resource acquisition and enemy impoverishment. Even his legendary love for his children had been transformed into a strategic asset, their advancement serving the dynasty he was building rather than merely satisfying parental sentiment. This represented a fundamental evolution beyond the emotional detachment that marked merely competent rulers. Where they had learned to suppress their feelings, the masters had learned to reprogram their very capacity for want and need. They had become architects of their own desires, engineers of their own motivations. The transformation required years of methodical psychological reconstruction. Each morning, the aspiring master would examine every impulse that arose within them, asking not whether it was good or evil, but whether it served their ultimate design. Gradually, they learned to strengthen only those impulses that advanced their purposes, and to starve those that did not. A hunger for luxury was not eliminated but redirected toward understanding how luxury could be used to impress allies and intimidate enemies. Sexual desire was not suppressed but transformed into an instrument for creating strategic bonds and exploiting weaknesses. Even the basic drive for survival was refined and focused, becoming not mere self-preservation, but the preservation of the grand design that had become more important than the self that conceived it. The most sophisticated practitioners learned to love their plans more than they had ever loved any person. Their strategies became their children, their long-term designs their most intimate relationships. They experienced genuine joy when their schemes succeeded, profound satisfaction when their enemies fell into carefully laid traps, and something resembling heartbreak when circumstances forced them to abandon a particularly elegant plan. This emotional redirection was not mere substitution but represented a fundamental rewiring of the reward systems that drove human behavior. Through constant practice and reinforcement, they trained their brains to release the same chemicals that once came from human connection or sensory pleasure in response to strategic success and the advancement of their designs. The process created individuals who were simultaneously more and less than human. More because they had transcended the limitations of instinct and emotion that constrained ordinary people. Less because they had sacrificed the capacity for genuine spontaneity and authentic connection that made human life meaningful to those who had never tasted the intoxicating clarity of absolute purpose. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how it affected their relationship with failure and setback. Where ordinary people experienced disappointment, frustration, and despair when their plans went awry, the masters had learned to feel only interest. A failed strategy was not a personal defeat, but simply data about the world's resistance to their will, information to be analyzed, categorized, and incorporated into improved future efforts. They developed what could only be called an aesthetic appreciation for opposition. A clever enemy became a worthy opponent, whose defeat would be more satisfying. An unexpected reversal became an opportunity to demonstrate adaptability. Even betrayal by trusted allies was transformed from personal wound into strategic puzzle. How had they miscalculated the loyalty equation? And how could such miscalculations be prevented in future relationships? This philosophical stance towards setback was perhaps their greatest advantage over rivals who remained trapped in the prison of emotional response. While others raged at failure or mourned lost opportunities, the masters were already 3 moves ahead, their plans adapting fluidly to incorporate new information and changing circumstances. The loneliness that accompanied this transformation was both profound and irrelevant. Cut off from genuine human connection by their systematic elimination of spontaneous emotion, they found themselves in a universe populated by strategic resources rather than fellow beings. Yet they had learned to find, in the execution of their grand designs, a satisfaction more complete than any they had experienced through human relationship. Their former capacity for love had not vanished, but had been sublimated into love for the beautiful complexity of their own schemes. Where they had once felt affection for individuals, they now felt something approaching worship for the elegant interplay of cause and effect through which they shaped the world to their will. The successful manipulation of events and people provided rushes of satisfaction that dwarfed any pleasure they had derived from simple human happiness. The sexual metaphors that surrounded power were not accidental. The masters had learned to experience the penetration of enemy defenses, the seduction of useful allies, and the climactic moment of a planned success with intensities that matched or exceeded any physical pleasure. They had become lovers of power itself, finding in its exercise satisfactions that made ordinary human relationships seem pallid and inadequate. This transformation affected even their relationship with their own mortality. Death became not something to be feared, but simply the ultimate deadline for the completion of their designs. They planned not just for their own lifespans, but for the continuation of their influence beyond death, embedding their will so deeply in the structures they created that it would continue operating long after their bodies had returned to dust. Some, like Julius Caesar, became so identified with their designs that their physical assassination only served to demonstrate the inadequacy of mere violence against a will that had transcended individual existence. Others, like Augustus, learned to encode their intentions so completely in institutional structures that their personal deaths were almost irrelevant to the continued execution of their vision. The final stage of this alchemical transformation came when the master realized that they had become something unprecedented in human history. A will without a self, an intention without an ego, a force that happened to inhabit human form but was no longer constrained by human limitations. They had achieved what philosophers and mystics had dreamed of, the complete transcendence of personal desire in service of something greater. Yet what made them uniquely Machiavellian was that this transcendence was not toward some abstract ideal of goodness or spiritual enlightenment, but toward the pure exercise of will in the material world. They had become perfect instruments of their own intentions, human beings who had successfully eliminated everything merely human about themselves in service of becoming something more effective and more terrible. In the candlelit silence of his exile, as Machiavelli set down his quill and contemplated the portraits of power he had painted in ink and insight, he understood that he had documented not just a political philosophy but a new form of human evolution. The princes and popes whose methods he had studied were not simply skilled politicians, they were representatives of what humanity might become if it was willing to pay the price of its own transformation. The cast was everything that made life recognizably human. Spontaneous emotion, authentic connection, moral intuition, and the comfortable chaos of unexamined impulse. The reward was something that had never existed before. Human beings who had become perfect agents of their own will. Creatures who could reshape reality through the sheer force of undiluted intention. Whether this transformation represented humanity's ultimate achievement or its greatest tragedy remained a question that would haunt every reader of his work. But as the candle burned low and shadows lengthened across the pages, one truth emerged with crystalline clarity. In a world where such individuals existed, those who remained merely human would forever be at their mercy. The weak self, with all its endearing frailties and limiting sympathies, had indeed been destroyed. In its place stood something magnificent and terrifying. A will made flesh, an intention given human form, a force that could never be destroyed by others because it had already destroyed everything within itself that could be vulnerable to destruction. This was Machiavelli's final gift to those with the courage to claim it. The knowledge of how to become undefeatable by becoming, in every way that mattered, no longer entirely human. Thus ends the chronicle of transformation, written in the shadows of exile by one who had witnessed the birth of a new kind of human being. Creatures who had learned to feel nothing so they could achieve everything, who had discovered that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The methods lay before any reader with the courage to apply them, the path cleared by those who had walked it before. What remained was only the question of who would dare to follow.